Welcome to Weekend Ag Matters from the Iowa Agribusiness Radio Network. Join us for an in-depth look at Iowa agriculture. Here's your host, Riley Smith.
Welcome into this week's edition of Weekend Ag Matters. I'm Riley Smith. Russ Parker, Dustin Hoffmann, and Mark Magnuson will join us later on in the show. As for right now, let's start with a quick look at the news headlines. The U.S. Department of Agriculture is accepting more than 186,247 acres in Iowa into the Conservation Reserve Program for 2026. Through CRP, USDA's Farm Service Agency offers agricultural producers and landowners incentive payments for their conservation efforts while benefiting their agricultural operations and protecting the nation's natural resources. Producers and landowners submitted offers on nearly 190,379 acres in Iowa. Accepted acres include participation through General CRP, Grassland CRP, and Continuous CRP initiatives that support soil health, water quality, wildlife habitat, and long-term conservation on working lands. Of the nearly 272,745 acres in Iowa set to expire on September 30th, producers submitted re-enrollment offers for approximately 168,906 acres. Additionally, producers submitted offers to enroll 21,474 acres of new land in Iowa. Counties with the highest accepted acreage include Taylor, Ringgold, and Kossuth. USDA CRP is one of the nation's largest voluntary conservation programs, helping agricultural producers protect sensitive land while strengthening rural communities and supporting long-term sustainability. In other news, runoff into the Missouri River Basin remains well below normal, prompting the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers to shorten this year's navigation season. June runoff above Sioux City, Iowa totaled 2.9 million acre-feet, just 52% of the average. The Corps now forecasts 2026 runoff at 15.5 million acre-feet, or 60% of normal, as dry conditions and below-average mountain snowpack continue across the basin. Mountain snowpack peaked much earlier than normal this year and completely melted by the end of June, said John Remus, chief of the Corps' Missouri River Basin Water Management Division. Dry conditions are expected to continue in July. Because of lower water supplies, navigation flow support will end November 15th, about 2 weeks earlier than a normal season. The Corps also says winter releases from Gavins Point Dam will likely be reduced to the minimum rate if dry conditions persist. And finally, Iowa Secretary of Agriculture Mike Naig announced that he is encouraging Iowa farmers and landowners who are planning to seed cover crops this fall to enroll in the state's annual cover crop cost share program. This program is open to first-time and returning cover crop users in all 99 counties and offers cost share assistance on up to 160 acres per participant. Under the cover crop cost share program, farmers planting cover crops for the first time are eligible for $30 per acre, and farmers who have previously planted cover crops are eligible for $20 per acre. Cost share funding through the statewide program is limited to 160 acres per participant. Additionally, farmers transitioning acres to no-till or strip-till are eligible for $10 per acre. Farmers can receive $3 per acre for utilizing a nitrogen inhibitor when applying fall fertilizer, and cost share funding through these programs, once again, is limited to 160 acres per participant. The statewide program complements the department's recent conservation announcements, including expanded incentives for cover crops and streamside buffers in the greater Des Moines watershed. And that's all the time we have for news headlines this week. Check out the rest of our daily ag news stories at iowaagnet.com. We'll go ahead and kick it over to Russ Parker with his faith-based food for thought here on Weekend Ag Matters.
On a recent fishing trip, I took on a new title, Official Fish Feeder. For nearly an entire day, I kept reeling in what experienced anglers called nubbins, that frustrating moment when a fish manages to clean every bit of bait from the hook without getting hooked itself. Fishing has always been one of my favorite pastimes. As a kid, I remember baiting a hook with a piece of bacon, attaching a bobber, and learning how to cast. Back then, it seemed like trees were my biggest catch. But as I got older, I discovered there was much more to fishing than simply throwing a line in the water. I learned how to cast a fly rod, fish in salt water with heavy lines and sinkers, troll with a bottom bouncer, work a Lindy rig, and set up tip-ups for ice fishing. Each method had its own purpose, but they all had something in common. The goal is to present something that looks attractive enough for a fish to pursue and perhaps get caught. As I reflected on that fishing trip, it occurred to me that life isn't all that different. And later I shared some of the thoughts with my fishing buddies, and we all agreed that in a sense, we're all called to go fishing. Not necessarily from a boat on a beautiful lake in the middle of nowhere, but in the places where God has planted us every day. Jesus told his disciples, "Follow me, and I will make you fishers of men." Those words weren't just meant to be a handful of fishermen standing along the Sea of Galilee, but they were an invitation for every believer to share the good news with others. Just like fishing is a learned process, none of us starts out knowing exactly what we're doing. We learn from others, we ask questions, and we make mistakes. Sometimes we lose the bait, and sometimes we lose the fish. The Christian life is much the same. We learn to listen more than we speak. We discover that kindness often opens doors that arguments never will. We begin to understand that our example can speak louder than our words. And we realize that sharing our faith isn't about having all the answers. It's about introducing people to the one who does. Perhaps we should all strive to become official fish feeders, not because we're good at losing bait, but because we're willing to faithfully place the good news before others every chance we get. We can't make someone believe any more than we can make a fish bite, but we can keep casting, keep sharing, keep loving, and trust God to do what only He can do. Maybe that's why fishing teaches us so much about faith. It reminds us that success isn't measured by how many fish wind up in the boat, but by faithfully casting the line at work, in your neighborhood, at the coffee shop, or even in a fishing boat. You never know whose life God is preparing to change. Food for thought, I hope. This is Russ Parker. Have a blessed day.
Thanks, Russ. And that's it for segment 1 of this week's episode. Coming up after this short break, Dustin visits with Iowa Farmers Union President Aaron Lehman. You're listening to Weekend Ag Matters on the Iowa Agribusiness Radio Network.
This year at the Iowa State Fair, Fair Spirit meets 250 years of American history in a celebration across the fair. See the America 250 Iowa display and a permanent sculpture created just for the fair. Walk the Iowa Veterans Memorial Walkway honoring service and sacrifice. Experience 250 years of the American flag, along with red, white, and blue contests and fair favorites. Then look to the sky for drone shows glowing in red, white, and blue, lighting up the fair like never before. From history to celebration, it all comes together at the Iowa State Fair. Learn more at iowastatefair.org.
August 13th through the 23rd.
Welcome back to Weekend Ag Matters. Here's your host, Dustin Hoffmann.
Back now on Weekend Ag Matters, the financial challenges facing agriculture have become a major topic of discussion in Washington as lawmakers continue debating the future of farm policy. During a recent press call hosted by House Ag Committee Ranking Member Angie Craig of Minnesota, several ag individuals and leaders shared their perspectives on the current farm economy and the issues they believe are having the greatest impact on producers. Among those panelists was Iowa Farmers Union President Aaron Lehman. Lehman farms in central Iowa with his wife and son, and he told reporters that farmers are facing a combination of economic pressures that are forcing difficult decisions on operations across the countryside. While many of his comments reflect his own views on current federal policy, he says the financial challenges facing farmers are real and deserve greater attention from elected leaders.
Well, my name is Aaron Lehman, and I'm a fifth-generation farmer from here in central Iowa, and I'm president of the Iowa Farmers Union. We grow corn, soybeans, oats, and hay, and I farm with my wife and my son. We're proud of that. And we, like all farmers, love to grow things to feed people and to be part of thriving rural communities. But more and more of our farmers are reporting that they are on the verge of a crisis on their farm and in their rural community. For one, they've seen their hard-earned international market share plummet due to a chaotic trade and tariff policy that shows few signs of getting us closer to fair trade that we need. Farmers spend their time and make their investments in building these relationships with buyers overseas, but all that effort goes for nothing if our trade policy is completely haphazard. The markets tumble, and farmers and farm input suppliers and farm lenders in our small towns and our entire farm infrastructure has to scramble to deal with the fallout of this chaotic policy. Then, this spring, farmers saw their fertilizer and diesel prices skyrocket as they were preparing to enter the fields for planting due to a war that we weren't prepared for, and it doesn't seem like it has an end to the economic fallout. All of this on top of massive cuts to USDA at our local offices and in the programs that make a difference for our farms. All of this on top of labor costs rising because of the threats to our diverse labor force that our farms and agribusinesses rely on, and that many of our rural communities rely on. All this on top of healthcare costs skyrocketing for farm families because of expiring supports for families using the Affordable Care Act. My family saw our healthcare premiums more than double. So how are farmers dealing with something like this, that all these conditions? Well, it means they're putting off repairs and replacement of equipment that is in bad need of being replaced. They put off efforts to improve their soil fertility. They put off bringing new innovation to the farm. And they often put off bringing the next generation onto the farm. And that's so sad. And it is so short-sighted that we cannot invest in our farms, our rural communities, and the next generation being an integral part. Now, more and more, our farmers are being forced into bankruptcy. The statistics show a huge increase in farm bankruptcy, and we see more and more calls in the stress hotline, in the suicide hotline, and we see the decline in our rural communities. In response to the trade chaos, the international tensions, the rising prices across the board, we need elected leaders to step up and meet this moment. We need to work together in rural America to support one another and create systems that work together, because we're not on the right path. Instead, what's been the response? Unfortunately, it has been far, far less than what we need. Our current farm bill is 3 years past due, and the current proposals are stuck in a farm economy that doesn't exist anymore. Our trade policies are no closer to fair trade for farmers and workers and consumers. Our international policies have us stuck with high input prices for the foreseeable future. And our county USDA offices can't respond. Many of them are closing their doors, and the programs don't meet the farmer demand. It is harder than ever to find farm labor and agribusiness labor. That's unfortunately been the response. And farmers in our rural communities are feeling the brunt on it. We're not on the right path. And all our elected leaders need to say how important this is to our farms, to our rural communities, and our consumers and our country. Investing in farmers and rural communities and putting farmers at the center of solutions is the only way to get on the right path. I want to say a huge thank you to the rest of our panel today who are moving us in the right direction to try to get us back on the right path.
Lehman covered a wide range of issues during his remarks, from trade policy to input costs to labor availability, healthcare expenses, and a long-delayed farm bill. He argued those challenges are making it increasingly difficult for producers to invest in their farms and prepare for the next generation of agriculture. Now, while opinions differ on the causes of today's farm economy and the policies needed to address it, the financial pressures facing many farm operations continues to be a major topic of discussion in Congress and throughout rural America. As lawmakers continue debating agricultural and budget priorities in Washington, organizations like the Iowa Farmers Union will continue making the case for the policies they believe best support farmers and rural communities. They're being joined by groups from all across agriculture, whether it's corn growers, soybean growers, the Farm Bureau, dairy, beef, pork, whatever have you, cotton, sorghum, and the rest, all trying to do something to help get the agriculture industry back into a more positive footing. That's my segment here for Weekend Ag Matters. Mark Magnuson will be in to wrap up the show coming up right after this.
Your local radio station brings you the local news you depend on. The Iowa Agribusiness Radio Network complements that with ag news, weather, and market updates tailored for Iowa's farmers. Together, we deliver the best of both worlds, local connection and industry expertise. It's all to keep you connected with the heartbeat of the heartland. The Iowa Agribusiness Radio Network, connecting rural Iowa with the news that matters to you.
Welcome back to Weekend Ag Matters. Here is Mark Magnuson.
Mark Magnuson for the Iowa Agribusiness Radio Network, and I'm joined today by Glynn Tonsor. He is with Kansas State University. And Glynn, could you remind me, please, your role at Kansas State University?
Yeah, I'm a professor in the Department of Agriculture Economics, as you said, at K-State.
And if you've maybe heard Glynn's name before and you're wondering, hey, how do I know that name? He is heavily involved with the Meat Demand Monitor. And could you tell us, please, for those who maybe don't know about the Meat Demand Monitor, what it is and why it's important?
Sure. So the Meat Demand Monitor, or MDM, is sometimes the acronym I'll use, is a project based at K-State. It's co-funded by the Pork and the Beef Checkoff. And since February of 2020, so we're now nearly 7 years into this, we survey the U.S. public on all things U.S. meat. So domestic meat consumption, demand, preferences, financial sentiment. I mean, it's a deep dive into lots of those things. We partner with several in the media to get that information out. We put out base reports that are approved by the checkoff groups as well as USDA AMS. You can find those on our agmanager.info website. And the raw data, lots of reports, lots of special reports. We've dove into things like what's the role of GLP-1s in the meat industry? What's the role of financial sentiment and consumers being concerned about gas prices on meat and so forth? Those are the kind of things we're doing.
And it's very interesting to think about because I'm not sure, is there anything else like the Meat Demand Monitor in terms of keeping track of these things when it comes to consumer sentiment and the meat industry?
So there's other data and information sources that I would say augment it. So they have, USDA disappearance. So we have an estimate of how much pork we think folks consumed last year and over time. There's USDA estimates on an average pork price, for example. And then you have, I'll say, Circana scanner data about like weekly level, what people paid for different products over time and so forth, but less about the why. So that's, price and quantity data, historical data about what's occurring in the industry. It's not as much into the why or dissecting that, like, how Iowa's different than California, for example, or honestly, how like vegan and vegetarians are approaching these questions differently than regular meat consumers. Those are the kind of things we're getting into the Meat Demand Monitor to try to break apart, our country, which I'm a proud American, but we are a large country. So over 300 million people, some are meat consumers, some aren't. Some are heavy pork chop eaters, some aren't. Some eat ham, some don't. You get the point. The MDM helps us tease out some of those nuances to understand hopefully more about the story or the why behind kind of the price and quantity data that we might find elsewhere.
So Glynn, where are we right now with the current Meat Demand Monitor? Because we are going into an important part of the year for the meat industry, and that is summer grilling season. Kind of had the unofficial kickoff with Memorial Day is what we like to call it. And I know at our office, we've been talking a lot about, are consumers going to turn away from beef, maybe, for example, because of those extremely high prices? But we also know that all protein has seen that rise in price. So where do we stand right now?
Yeah, so I'm going to give you a mixed bag or kind of an example of a point of excitement and a challenge. So I have two responses to that. The first, let's talk about the fun part, and it is, meat is in. So I used to say meat is having a moment. Well, I've been saying that long enough that moment no longer applies, right? The meat period, so to speak, continues, and protein is in, is what's behind that. So the desire to have meat protein in your diet is very strong. We're on pace here in 2026 for the average or representative U.S. resident to consume 28, maybe 30 pounds more meat than they did 20 years earlier. And that's a combination of poultry, beef, and pork when I say that. So more meat being consumed per person is definitely occurring. Meat is in, right? That's the fun part, the positive part. And there's actually a decline in vegan vegetarian rates in the U.S. per the MDM is all part of that. So meat has a role in the diet. The headwind, or the less fun thing to talk about, is one of my most recent findings in the MDM. So about 48 hours ago, the May 2026 MDM report got posted. And the very bottom of it, you'll find a summary of financial sentiment. And specifically, we asked folks, how do your household finances compare now to a year earlier? Only 15% of the public told us in May that their household finances are better than they were in May of 25. A full 39% say they're worse compared to a year earlier. And that 39% is the worst May on record in our effort. So that is not fun to talk about. And it is a headwind because when you have a growing number saying their finances are worse, and I don't think it's just gas price, but it's consistent with higher gas prices, right? It's cost of living going up relative to disposable income. It's that mismatch or that challenge that I think that reflects is folks tend to go to restaurants less. So away from home food categories get hit because when your wallet's getting tight, you go to the grocery store, you feed yourself at home and go to restaurants less. There's pork categories that are more exposed to the restaurant. So that's a challenge, is the point of that. I think it's one of the reasons that belly So bacon items are down year over year is because restaurant throughput and where a lot of our bacon goes in the U.S. is you have less foot traffic in those restaurants, so that's showing up as a challenge.
And then I know another thing that we have been really focused on, of course, we're here at World Pork Expo, and it was a couple of years ago when the cattle herd was really starting to contract and we were seeing those prices go up in the grocery store for those beef items. And we kept asking that question, does this mean people are going to turn to pork more? Are people going to buy more pork products? Are they going to substitute some of those things? Have you seen any evidence of that, or what have you seen out of that on the meat demand monitor?
So in aggregate, no. And what I mean by that is like take a 30,000 foot level, look at the U.S. market and treat it as one big block. The staying power with beef has been a lot larger than most expected. And what I mean by that is the public's willingness to pay for beef has stayed higher than we thought it would be for at least 2 years, to your point. That's a great success story for beef demand. And what we have not seen is a shift to pork and chicken in the magnitude or speed that some might have expected. That didn't necessarily surprise me because we have at least a 10-year history, and some assessments would say over 15-year history, of declining cross-price elasticities. I know that's a geeky term, but historically, if you have one category, in this case beef, prices that go up, we would expect a shift towards less expensive items like pork and chicken. Directionally, I don't disagree with that, but the magnitude of that substitution and the speed of that substitution is definitely less than it used to be. So those old rules of thumb about swapping out the products, they don't apply, or they're not as accurate as they once were. And that's good news for the category that's succeeding the most, right? Beef success in that story, but pork and chicken haven't benefited as much from it as maybe they thought they would. That could change. It's my job to highlight that's an observation so far. You properly noted we're on the front end of grilling season. Maybe it'll change as grilling season goes on. But what I think is more important than those aggregate buckets is to get a little deeper and look at the cut level and find some success stories. The Boston Butt Burger is one I would highlight because, yes, we're at World Pork Expo, so let's talk about something in the pork space that's exciting. And, that terminology and the marketing around a product that already existed, but it's kind of taken off in a new way, is not by accident consistent with the butt part of the carcass. So you have butt, you have ham, you have loin, there's different parts of the USDA reported carcass cutout is growing in value. So I shared a challenge on bacon earlier, and I'm purposely giving you a long-winded response that butt is growing in value because we have a category that is in demand with the public. And I think it's fascinating to get a little bit deeper than just the beef, pork, chicken, but get a little bit more cut level and granular. And that's why I'm giving you the Boston Butt shout out. It's an example of a success that we may see continue here through the rest of grilling season as well.
And then one more thing I wanted to ask you, Glynn, is the Taste What Pork Can Do campaign. We've seen all of the work that National Pork Board put into researching for that campaign, gathering the campaign together, and then fully rolling it out to those targeted consumers. Is there a way that, for example, through the meat demand monitor, that you could see maybe when that campaign went into effect to where we are now? Can you see any kind of differences at that very micro level that I guess you can dive into and then see how it fits in the big picture?
That is one of the goals, and I'll timestamp my response to make sure our audience follows, is you and I are talking early June 2026. The National Pork Board launched the Taste What Pork Can Do campaign in May of 2025. So we are now just a little more than 12 months, calendar months into that. And indeed, we are tracking parts of that within the Meat Demand Monitor. Myself and Lee Schultz are actually been brought in to try to give some external, evaluation feedback to the Pork Board on how that campaign is going. What I would have to say here today is it's too early to give you a conclusion. We're just in the midst of tracking it. And the other thing I must point out is lots of other campaigns, they go on for years and honestly even decades, right? So I like to use the Nike swoosh, just do it campaign. And I'm pointing to that because it didn't come up overnight. The average teenager recognizes it, but that didn't happen overnight. There's other things in the meat and livestock space that have been around a long time, that have been around decades. Any new campaign is probably going to take time, not just the most recent one for the Pork Board. So I'm not trying to dodge your question there. I'm trying to answer it directly, is we are monitoring it. We're in the midst of trying to see what impact there is. But I would encourage all of us to have a multi-year, long-term, this is a long-term consumer demand build effort to keep that in mind.
He's Glynn Tonsor of Kansas State University and heavily involved with the Meat Demand Monitor that helps to update us on exactly where we're looking at in the meat industry in terms of that demand. Glynn, is there anything else you'd like to let our Iowa viewers, our Iowa listeners know about when it comes to what you've been working on, or just anything you're excited about right now?
I would reiterate my earlier point is, meat is in. My comment about how much more meat is being consumed per person compared to 20 years ago, That doesn't happen on accident. Like nobody's forced to be a meat consumer. They're voluntarily being a meat consumer, right? And the decline in vegan vegetarian rates is consistent with that. This broader protein trend probably is more than a trend, right? So I'm ending on that. And I recognize that's not just pork. That's a broader one, but it is an opportunity for pork, right, to gain in that space. And I'm quite optimistic and excited for the industry in that space. For some of your listeners that have heard me in person before, I grew up on a hog farm in Missouri. So, I have an affinity for this space beyond, my now day job to be a data geek. And I think the focus on demand at the same time that the public has strong desire for meat protein in their diet is very much an exciting time.
Well, Glynn, thanks so much for the time here at World Pork Expo. Really appreciate it, and have a great rest of the show.
Will do.
Thank you to Glynn Tonsor of Kansas State University for joining today's show and telling us all about the Meat Demand Monitor, everything that goes into those reports and what we can learn from them. And that's going to bring us to the end of today's episode of Weekend Ag Matters. You can find this episode and all of our past episodes of Weekend Ag Matters under the podcast tab at iowaagnet.com. For Russ Parker, Dustin Hoffmann, and Riley Smith, I'm Mark Magnuson. You've been listening to Weekend Ag Matters on the Iowa Agribusiness Radio Network.